Welcome to Improving's Virtual Lunch and Learn. Today we have Daniel Schufler presenting TDD for People. Thank you for joining us today again. And remember, our events can always be accessed at improving.com/virtual events. Take it away, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Michael. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for TDD for People. Now, I always like to start our meetings with an agenda so you all know where we're heading. Of course, we will be talking about TDD because that's, of course, the starting point for this. But my goal for this talk is to turn your experience in TDD to a liminal bridge. That is an experiential bridge that you can now cross into a completely new concept, talking about how TDD helps us drive our code as communication. From there, we'll talk about the variety of conversations that are actually happening when you and one other person converse. And from there, we'll talk about the tools, especially TDD for People, that we'll be building up today. Now, as we go through this presentation, there will be a couple of moments where I will pause and invite questions or answers from the audience. Please pay attention to the little banner up there of "That's your cue." That will be mostly at the end for specific questions, but there will be some audience participation points where I would love to hear your thoughts. Now, without further ado, who the heck is this guy talking to you? My name is Daniel Schufler. I'm a Christian, a husband, and a father, and most recently an improver. And one of the quotes I have taken with me to every client I join is to see with eyes unclouded. My goal is to understand as much as I can the reality of what's going on behind the work we do. And in software, that inevitably means understanding people, which is some of where this talk came from. But I need to give a big disclaimer because I learned from others. TDD for People is not my idea. I learned it from a book called Agile Conversations, and with the permissions of the authors, I am representing it here for your edification and hopefully for the betterment of your projects in the future. Now, getting into TDD, I want to ask a broad question. Why do we code? Well, we write code because we'd like to teach the computer to do a job we don't want to. That is, we want to create a behavior there. All right, that's why Excel sheets exist, so I don't have to do my budget. We want it to improve service to others. I want to make this website not so much of a pain to use. I'd like to be able to check out with a single click. Thank you very much, Amazon.com, for having me spend my money. Or I want to write this as a way to genuinely reduce the burden on others. I want to be able to help the farmers see where their crops are in fact getting too much water or not enough so that they may only spend the water where it matters. Now, in that, we have developed a practice, TDD, which is test-driven development. I mean, by its name, it's pretty simple to figure out what it does. You write a test, a unit test usually, first. And since you're writing it first, there's no code for it to work, which means it fails. And then you go and write the function that should implement a part of it. And you iterate back and forth through these until you have covered the intended use case. Now, that allows and gives rise to a usage manner called red-green refactor, namely for the red failing text of the first test, which is then replaced by green passing text of I have written the code to make it work, and then I change the code, I change its structure, I refactor it. But TDD is much deeper than that, you see. It's not just about writing better code. It certainly is a technical practice which has that as its core goal. But as you start practicing it, you'll very rapidly start interacting with things like BDD, or behavior-driven development, which is going to force you into conversations with, you guessed it, people. But before we get into the people side of it, stay with me on the technical. When we're doing TDD, we did this for a reason. It was because our code wasn't behaving like we expected it to. We had what's called a bug, where the stuff I released production didn't do what it was supposed to do. Oops. Why? Well, frankly, code is a form of communication, namely between myself and the box of electrons sitting in front of me. I want it to do something. I want to transmute the idea into the box by magic, or in this case, really by words, like keywords, int, var, char, all of these wonderful things. But they are a means for me to communicate my intent into the computer to become a behavior, which means I'm in effect having a conversation. So here's one of those moments where I would love for the audience to jump in, but there are two conversations that TDD helps you to improve by forcing you to think about the uses your code is going to go through. Who do you think those conversations are with?
Are the conversations with the developer and QA?
Actually, that's definitely one of them. And thank you, whoever remembered to go and talk to your QA as part of this, because after all, who's going to be the one finding that bug? It's going to be your QA. They're going to start taking your code as a black box and then start smashing on it like a user would. User smash. Well, hopefully your users aren't the Hulk. But they're going to take that time to think about how am I going to interact with this new feature you build in the context where it matters. And they're going to try and build it. So if you want to build better tests, you're naturally going to want to talk to your QA. What else?
I also have a suggestion here for the developer and product owner.
Ooh, very clever. Yes, because after all, how do you determine what code you're supposed to be writing in the first place? You talk to your product owner. In Agile, that's the person who's representing the business, saying, I would love to be able to, and then they're the ones describing they would like this kind of behavior, whether it be a UX interaction, the computation that a complex, I don't know, algorithm is going to compute, making suggestions for what movies you're going to watch, or maybe something so simple as the cart needs to actually do the right job of summing and totaling, and I needed to apply my coupons. But your product owner is the other critical conversation that as a developer you need to have, because you need to understand what's in their head, because your job is not to make it up, but to implement what they're thinking of. Just like your QA's job is to test it like what they're thinking of. And so your two conversations really are the developer and the QA and the developer and the PO. One for building the developer's understanding and one for building the developer's ability and understanding of how he might break or test the code he's about to write. And so that brings me to this core idea that your code is a form of communication. I mean, that's why we call it a programming language, right? It is a set of communication codified by the developer, but it is representative of the two conversations, your developer and the PO, and the developer and the QA. Specifically, the tests are the codification of the developer and the QA, and they are indicative of the conversation that the PO and the developer had, which is implemented in the actual code's function. Do this. Okay, we did that. Can you prove it? Yes, I wrote the tests. And so with this in mind, TDD is hiding effectively two conversations. Well, not hiding, but benefiting from. It's trying to engender, trying to produce the tendency in you to go have two additional conversations. And it's a little interesting because while the developer is writing, he has to have all three of those conversations running in his head. Himself and the PO, himself and the QA, himself and the computer. And the more I thought about this, the more I realized that three conversations happening within two parties was actually fairly typical. You see, there are really a lot of ways for a conversation between two people to go awry, saying nothing for the computer, where TDD helps us. And it's because there are actually more conversations going on than just the ones that are verbalized, that a third-party observer might be able to literally hear. So suppose with me, we have Alice and Bob, two superheroes trying to talk about the way to save the world. There are actually going to be three conversations happening. But the obvious one is, of course, going to be Alice with Bob. Alice and Bob are going to have a conversation. And if I set a tape recorder out in the middle of the room, they will only hear the Alice and Bob conversation. But take a moment and step back. Suppose you remember a moment where you have a tough conversation with a loved one, your mom when you're in school because you didn't want to do your homework, or your spouse when you didn't want to take out the trash. I don't know why I'm picking all of these moments, but those moments when you are having a bit of conflict, there's going to be a little voice whispering in your ear, suggesting, hey, she doesn't know what she's talking about. Maybe you shouldn't listen. Or at least that's what the voice used to try and tell me. And as you extract that, if it's happening for you, there's a decent chance that that conversation you're having with yourself, the other party is doing the same. And we're all doing it so fast we almost don't realize it. That's because human beings are natural storytellers. Our job is to very quickly, like that, process the information in the world around us, danger, and run. But that gets us into some trouble sometimes. Because as we are processing this so rapidly, it comes very easy to just ignore that that processing is happening and simply assume whatever I come up with in my mind is completely factual, completely reasonable, completely erroneous. Oh, wait, not that last one. Because we're very confident in the stories we get because we're so used to going through those motions. And so there comes that question. If the conversations go awry because I'm having a conversation with me that Alice isn't part of, and Alice is having a conversation with herself that I'm not a part of, how do I solve this? Well, could we make the conversations all the same so that there's only one narrative? I don't have a competing story that she doesn't have. Kinda, but that's not really the best way. We both can and cannot make it so that there's only one conversation happening. We can't really silence the processing that's going to go on in our head, but we can manage it. And for certain, we cannot force Alice to have the same conversation in her head as is in mine. And so what we really need is to build an awareness of the conversation that's going on inside our head as we go through this process. Now, this is very similar to the kind of awareness the developer has to build while he's writing his tests. He needs to think about, how is the QA going to try and break this? What kind of cases did I talk about with them? He needs to be aware of the assumptions the product owner is coming in with. You know, when they said they wanted to apply this coupon, they're assuming it's a particular kind of coupon and that there are those right items in the cart. But he needs to have an awareness of this internal stuff, because while he's doing all of that, he's also going to be typing and thinking about the things he needs to think about. Oh, right, I need to make certain this is single responsibility. I need to make certain that I'm using dependency injection properly. I need to make certain that this thing is testable. Wait, what does that mean again? And all of these concerns are kind of floating around all together as you try in TDD. The benefit in TDD is that it gives you rock solid steps for how do I know I am doing the right job. Some of that is literally by taking the questions that came up that your QA is asking you and using those to make the tests. Some of that is by trying to keep it stated in as close to human language as possible from what the product owner told you. And so in all of those, I want to take the step back then. And just like we asked about code, why do we write code? What are we aiming at in a conversation? Because that why is going to help us understand why we are so driven to the little story we have in our head and why it's so hard to build that internal awareness of the conversation going on inside our mind. And so here's the second point for audience interaction. Why do we have work conversations?
I think one suggestion is to share knowledge, understanding, and perspective.
Yeah, it's very true. If you have a senior developer and a junior developer conversing, especially about a design, it's very much about building up the junior developer's understanding. Notice there's thankfully some roles that help us understand how that conversation is going to go. But very often when we have a conversation, it's because there's an idea in my head that I would like you to share. Or I don't get what you're doing. Can you explain it to me? Notice that the second one takes a slightly more adversarial approach and will elicit a different reaction. But the core intent is the same. Help me understand. What else?
I have a suggestion here for a coffee talk.
Ooh, coffee talk. Yes. I might file this one personally under something like building a relationship. We want to feel safe. We're social beings, frankly. And part of our needs are to feel like we belong, to feel like we are a member of the group, that we are safe in being here because others will have our back. Coffee talk is a small part of building that up, because let's be frank, no one really wants just small talk. We want to have small talk because of something else. Maybe it's the good feeling you get when you get to make small talk. Maybe it's that sense of these people know and care about me. Maybe it is the intent desperately to share the joy you just experienced. All of these are fantastic reasons, and they all play into that relational aspect of conversation. Are there any other answers?
Another suggestion is to make decisions.
Make decisions. Thank you. That honestly is where my brain goes first. Oh, I want to have a conversation with you because I want to get something done. I'm sorry, I'm very, very action-oriented. But that's legit. Why do we have, big old meetings with the director level coming down and we have all of these conversations in the architecture space? It's because we want to know how to get there. We want to make a decision about the path we're going to walk. And at least for me, I find that that drive to get something done, get there fast, get there efficiently, for me, that tends to be the reason why I get myself into the most conversational trouble. Because I want to run very quickly to the thing I care about. I'm so interested in that goal and I find it to be so valuable that I can forget some of the other pieces. Not merely that I'm trying to get action and therefore ignore relationship, nor get action and therefore ignore sharing understanding, but that because I'm so interested in, so what do I do with it, that I can skip steps. And so summarizing, why do we have conversations? Build a shared understanding. We want the group to share an understanding, an experience, a awareness of the true stance of what's going on. We want to build group consensus, which is very similar. That is that we are all of a similar, perhaps not the same, opinion and all willing to move in that space. Notice that this one plays a little bit into the relational space because I want people to agree. I don't want conflict while I'm trying to get to consensus because my goal is one shared answer. Now, of course, then there's the repair relationships. I've made a mistake. I bring some flowers and I have a conversation with my wife. Most of the time to the tune of, I'm sorry, dear, you were right. Or I may be having one to improve my relationship. You know, darling, that idea you had this morning, I had to think about it a little bit, but you know what? I think we could do one step better. Do you think this would be something you'd like to do? And where I'm trying to build and invest in it, where I'm telling them that I appreciate them, that they're smart, that I find them clever or cute in my wife's case. Talking about these things in a way so as to build up the experience of another, but not necessarily to get to, I want you to understand this one thing, or I want you to believe like I believe. I merely want to say that between you and I, we are safe, that you are appreciated. Which then brings us down to the last piece. And as I've highlighted, get action, which is my favorite spot to be. I want to get up and go, 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 go. And honestly, decision-making is a powerful reason why we want to converse. We want to either convince people that our decision is the right one to go with, or that we have made a decision, let's go get it, or to clarify, hey, so this was what you meant, right? But all of those come down to the same root question of, should I go this way? And of course, at the end, that's all about enabling us to do the work we came into a group to do. And so at work, I find a lot of conversations, not all, but a lot of the ones that get the title meeting turn into the kind of get action. Not all of them, but a lot of them are about design decisions or, hey, the product owner wants to see if we can do that. But it's all about making a call so that we can get to the end goal, which hopefully is delivering lots and lots of values to our customers. Now, how do we go from words passing in the air between two mammals to changes in the actions of said mammals? Remember how I was telling you that there's a conversation happening with Bob and himself that happens so fast that sometimes Bob isn't aware of it himself. And as a result, there's that question. How did that go from being words spoken to Bob taking an action? And so allow me to introduce the Ladder of Inference. Now, again, this is not an idea I came up with. You'll be able to find lots of references to this online, and I encourage you to go look them up. But the basic ladder runs like this. You have a ladder leaning up against a wall, but it's resting in a pool of observable facts, the kind of stuff that I would put down a recorder in the middle of a room, and if I could scan every aspect of it, all of the observable facts as observed by a neutral third party are what we're talking about. What specifically was said? What was their stance? Did they flip their hair right as they said it? These are observable facts. But then from those, because let's be frank, the brain has no way of processing everything that comes into it in a split second and making a meaningful value-added decision. Because let's be frank, when you see large moving shadow object, your thought is either, oh dear, that's a bear and run, or it's, I wonder what that is, and they're getting clobbered. And so our brain, for the perspective of it, has evolved to, no, I'm going to very quickly select the data that matters. I don't care that the shadow was slightly reddish in tinge. I'm going to move. Because I selected that the important data was shadow moving towards me, not red shadow or large red shadow. Merely, there's something coming, I should move. Notice how that, of course, takes to the next step. Assumption, danger. Now, With this trick, a lot of our assumptions are kind of hidden from us unless we're able to see what our filtering did. Because the kind of data we then hand to an assumption is really about filling in a hole. There are parts of the story that are missing that I honestly just make it up because I don't need to know all the details to get to an action. I just need to know enough, and because I'm so driven to make a coherent story, I will select certain assumptions, and we'll get to how I select those assumptions in a minute, to fill in the gap. From this selected data and the gap being filled by assumptions, I will now attempt to draw a conclusion. This is good. This is bad. I should run. I will make a decision and evaluate it, judge it, for the information that is there. Because by the time I bake an assumption into the story, it's very difficult for me to separate an assumption from data, from the stuff that I explicitly left out. But as soon as I get to a conclusion, oh, they're out to get me, that'll reinforce a belief. Or it'll change a belief. I might have originally thought, oh, these people are going to be super friendly. And then I saw them pulling out big sticks, and I'm like, uh-oh, maybe they're not really here to have nice trade. And so my beliefs will change based upon the conclusions I draw. And then, after all of that has happened, basically conclusion gets translated into action. If my belief was already, they're going to come and hurt me, I will hightail it out of there once I see the big stick getting drawn, not knowing it might have just been a ceremonial greeting where they're trying to show me a great honor. Oops. And this is where the belief thing gets really scary. Our beliefs change what data we will filter for. Our beliefs change what assumptions we insert into the spaces to make a conclusion. Because if our conclusion comes up and completely disagrees with our belief, it'll have a kind of a delaying action. It'll diminish. Maybe I won't run if I genuinely believe that they are trying to do me honor because we're friends, even if they pull out big sticks. But if I don't believe that, it'll accelerate right out and I won't even think about it. Because now those big sticks coming out, regardless of what they say, will always mean to me, run. And so I want to take this from being, more tribal and talk about an experience that you might have had. Let's have an example conversation. And I call this fighting with the ladder, an example taken from sprint planning, junior developer. So I think I need to pull in some work from feature ABC that we weren't going to start until about 2 months from now. Me, why? We have plenty of work in the financial module. Me, no. We've got plenty of work in the financial module. Go pick one of those stories. We really need to get a tight rein on this junior dev. They're going all over the place. Me thinking. Junior dev responds, I can't. I will take one of the starting features for ABC. And on goes the conversation. To me internally, I should have done a better job filtering this during the interview. That was not a pleasant conversation, was it? But also notice, you got to have some insight on that conversation between me and myself. And so I want to draw some observations from that. 1, I was overdriven towards do. Control the action of the junior dev. Control my action. Darn it, I should have gone and fixed my process in interviewing. Go do. With a ton of assumptions. And quite frankly, I didn't care. I didn't even think to ask what the junior dev was doing there. Didn't ask why. I just saw their choice as wrong and went to correct it. Not a great look. And I'll be frank, I have had this kind of a conversation before, not that exact one. And every time I come back to look at it, I'm always embarrassed. I'd like to say it's because I've learned, but I will admit this ability to stop yourself in the middle of a conversation like this and honestly ask, why am I like this? Why am I driving that hard? Is hard, like really hard. But based on these observations, you can see how I flew from observing a fact, the junior dev is saying that they want to pull in a feature from ABC, which is due in 2 months, to concluding, what the heck are they doing? They're all over the place. You notice that story I told, and it relied really, really heavily on assuming their rationale and motive, that they didn't want to do the most value-added work, they just wanted to be off on their own. No, I'm going to control that. Was I right? I don't know. Never gonna know. Can't go back and ask them. Was there a way I could have checked? And especially with an awareness of the ladder, the answer, thank God, is yes, you can. And this is where TDD for people really comes in. Because if you think about the way TDD is written, it's effectively asking questions of your code. Hey, when I hand you this, what do you do? And then testing the answer against an assumption. Ah, there's that word again. You're allowed to keep your assumptions. You don't have to expunge them, but you need to keep them in check and you need to test against them. And so with that thought in mind, let's build TDD up using the ladder. But remember, we start at the bottom of the ladder, not at the top. So we have to go all the way back from observable facts, which are common to everyone, and we can work on your observation skills in a separate conversation. But we have to first start with, what data did you pick? It sounds like some data point you found relevant is the cause for our primary concern. Am I right in focusing on that? In the junior dev conversation, that might have been like, hey, I notice you're picking up this other feature, but we have most of this feature on board. Am I correct in seeing that? From selected data, we need to go work on how we're filling in the holes in our data, the assumption layer. So based upon the selected data, and that we're assuming that that's causing us trouble because proposed reason. I'm asking another question. I am probably still pretty confident of my proposed reason, but I'm at least allowing them to add to the common observable facts their rationale or their perspective on the cause. For the junior dev conversation, this might have looked like, so I'm assuming you don't want to work on the financial area because it's too hard, because it'll take you longer than a sprint, because you're not certified yet? But ask. And I think by now you're starting to see, hey, all of these have a kind of common basis. And it starts with curiosity. I may still be super confident that I am selecting the right data, I am assuming the right thing, but I am curious enough to recognize I don't have all of the data because I don't have the Alice and herself conversation half going on. And I am making a lot of assumptions based upon observable facts and my own internal conversation. Because then the next step after I figured out if I have assumed reasonably, not correctly, but reasonably, is to go and say, based upon selected data and our assumptions, it sounds like proposed path might be a reasonable approach. What do you think? Because I am now sharing a proposed path of action or a proposed decision or a proposed conclusion for all of these facts. With the junior dev, that might again have looked like, so if I'm correct in seeing that you're worried about the financial matters and you're worried that you're not certified yet, then yes, I think it would make sense for us to allow you to start on this other feature, but we should totally make it a priority to get you certified this sprint. Does that sound reasonable? And you'll see how it improves at each step. I'm no longer sounding like a complete A-hat. And ideally, they feel more valued. This allows me to play into that relational aspect of the conversation. Someone has taken the time to try to deeply understand where they're coming from. Not perfectly, perhaps. And it may turn out that their rationale is not good and I need to work on correcting that. But I'll be able to do it with better confidence, having walked through these things. But there's one last critical step you need to take, because after all, conclusions are not the top of the ladder. You need to check your beliefs. And this one I would encourage you to have as a conversation with yourself. Like go take some time and reflect on this. Go journal about it or talk about it with a mentor that you can share your reasoning with. Someone who's really good at listening in particular, because this is going to be a little harder because it takes more time to unpack. What have I learned about person, topic, idea that we were talking about from the conversation you were having in your own head, from the test you ran for all of those assumptions, testing your conclusion buildup to make certain that at every step it was as reasonable as two humans attempting as best they can to converse could make it. Because frankly, we're still going to make mistakes. No one is perfect, and you're still going to miss. Sometimes you'll miss a couple steps on the ladder and you'll start by checking the conclusion. Okay, good. At least you checked the conclusion. Then you can work on taking that step back and checking the assumption. But you always want to start as far down the ladder as you can because there will be less pain, less frustration, and the greater chance for understanding, mutual understanding, the first reason why we have conversations, to occur by practicing at the layer right after you have separated yourself from what everyone is seeing. And checking, is everyone seeing this same thing as important too? Because it could be that it's not important. Or it could be everyone agrees, dude, that is not okay, we need to fix this. But either way, you have built value by clarifying with your group and enforcing the shared meaning to be, yes, this thing is important, and you've now added to the pool of observable data. So here's an example of how that junior dev conversation might have gone more smoothly had I learned how to practice the ladder a little better, and is an example of one I had more recently. Junior dev. So I think I need to pull that work in from feature ABC, which is coming up in 2 months. Junior dev seems to not want to work on the financial modules, which are like the big thing this sprint. I wonder why. From my perspective, there's a lot more work left to do on the financial modules. Is there something stopping you from taking one of those? And I ask. And so it's like let me see if I can tease out their reasoning. Ask the question. Junior dev, I concur. That thing is the important bit, but I don't think my skill set is well suited for that work. Really? That was a skill set we specifically hired you for because you knew how to do it. Or at least it was something we could easily grow in you. I wonder why they're concerned. Is there a particular gap you're worried about? So now I can start teasing out like what are they worried about? And I can now start serving rather than directing. I no longer need to drive to the action of control, which is unfortunately my default. And I can instead drive towards the action of serve, which is a much better spot to be in. And so I hope with all of this, I can now let you to your questions, because at the end of the day, the intent for TDD people is to enable you to use what you already know how to do, questioning your code, in your own work. So what questions may I help you with? Have we got any questions, Michael?
No questions yet, Daniel.
Okay. So while we're waiting for a few more questions, I'll take a moment to kind of go back. Again, this ladder of inference can be applied in TDD, but it does take some practice and honestly some attention to detail. If I had to recommend a place to start, I would probably start by conversation journaling. And you can actually get a great explanation of what this might look like, the tool set for it, if you go read the Agile Conversations book. But basically, it just boils down to documenting as close as you can the observable facts of the conversation as it would be heard by a voice recorder, and the thoughts that happen to you. You don't even have to get the whole conversation, but be able to look at your thoughts and especially your emotional reactions to statements made by the other person so that you can examine the way you're thinking.
I have a question. If you have book recommendations on how to hold better conversations.
I do. So I recommend, of course, Agile Conversations as one particularly useful for the kind of conversations we're having here, but especially for those related to cultural transformations. I will recommend Crucial Conversations as one of the big books that has influenced the way I try to approach, honestly, those conversations that make me a little nervous and sweaty palms inside. And then lastly, and this one may seem a little bit odd, but I would recommend you to go start reading some of the work by one Brené Brown. She talks a lot about, well, borrowing her term, wholehearted living. And I have found a lot of the emotions that I had to deal with that prevented me from having effective conversations, I was able to more effectively deal with in the context she was providing them in. So I would strongly encourage you, go find Wholehearted Living, Gifts of Imperfection, one of those from Brené Brown, as a good place to also get some essentially along the side help.
I believe that's all we have for now.
Very good. Now, allow me to summarize then. Here's what I'm hoping you will be able to take away from this talk. 1, you can test your understanding during our conversation. Your experience in TDD will serve you well here. What's the next step? How do I build that next test? Just remember that the ladder of inference is that stepwise process that you've gotten used to with code, but now as a form to test your understanding in the conversation and to give you the opportunity to add shared meaning to it. Now, of course, with that, stay curious. That is among the hardest things I can think to do. And for me, at least, with my overdrive towards action, was the thing I had to learn to overcome. But if you can stay curious, you can test your assumptions with very simple questions. Hey, I'm noticing this. Is that also the important thing to notice here? Simple. Now, of course, it's going to take a little bit of humility. Sure. But being willing to ask questions, even when you're the expert in the room, will help you to provide the more valuable answers and hopefully, therefore, increase your success as well. Now, of course, with that, use the ladder to help you select the right questions for the challenge. Know where you are on the ladder or where you are in the conversation so that you don't have to go back to ask, is this the important thing when people know it is? That you don't have to check if this is a valid reasoning why this is the important thing or why it is of concern. And so that when you get to the point of sharing conclusions, there won't be a lot of competition or concern because people will have been building it up with you. And of course, through all of this, I have found it for me most helpful to aim at the following true north. Aim at best value, not efficiency, but effectiveness. You want to deliver service, deliver value to make your conversations more pleasant, more peaceful, more productive. And you're willing, or should be willing, to trade a little more time to get a far greater return. And hopefully, it'll also improve the stress in your own life where you're not feeling like you constantly need to correct or control or any of these other possible experiences as you go through it. And so with that, I had a request for book recommendations. I will again recommend Agile Conversations, whose authors have kindly allowed me to represent the idea of TDD for people. And so check out their website, check out their book. I highly recommend it. And thank you very much for your time.
I do have one more question for you, Daniel.
Certainly.
Can you take it to the next step? Even after the improved approach, there remains a disagreement and the clock is ticking.
Okay, so if I were to take it as this next step, now we are exiting a realm where the goal is merely a shared understanding and your goal really does become make a decision. Once you have done the effort to build, here are our shared assumptions, here are our shared beliefs of what's important, here are our shared potential conclusions, and you're still at an impassable crossroads. One of the things that may become necessary is to outline the decision-making rule. Now, there are a number of books on this. I believe Agile Conversations touches on it as well. But if you have to get to the point where you're making a decision, before you are worried about this conversation, make a decision with the group that here is how we will make a decision. It could be all of us will be consulted, but one guy, the boss, will make the decision. It could be that it would be my majority vote. It could be by consensus. But whatever that rule that you all decide on, and on whatever time frame, stick to it. If you agree that the rule was consensus and you still can't get to an agreement, then my recommendation is find the set of questions you need to answer on each side. Because if you have one guy who's completely intransigent and will not move, you need him to be able to answer, why won't you move? What are you afraid of? What are you looking for? And if you can articulate that, you can help him. If you can't, you probably need to revisit your decision-making rule. But if you are determined for consensus, then getting those questions and coming back as follow-up builds your decision from not just being, oh, we finally made it, which might be important, but now you have confidence in the decision you make. If you're at the point of there's a timeline, consensus probably isn't the decision-making model you want to use. It is the common one, and unfortunately is probably the assumption. But make certain you outline this before you have those tough conversations so that when the clock is ticking, you can still, with a level head, come to a reasonable approach, even if it's not perfect. Good question.
That is all we have for today. So thank you, everyone, for attending Improving's Virtual Lunch and Learn, and thank you, Daniel, for presenting today about TDD. The recording of this session and all previous sessions is available on our virtual events page at improving.com/virtual events, and it'll take you to our YouTube channel where you can see them all. We hope you enjoyed this talk and enjoy the rest of your afternoon and weekend.